close to 30 signatures. The letter to the governor to ask him to ask for the interim rule has 70 signatures. So there's tremendous support. In addition to that, Congressman Tierney is represented here tonight. He's been very supportive of that. Our two new United States senators are coming up to speed very quickly. Senator Warren has been here to meet with all of us. Senator Cowan is very interested and in fact has been part of discussions at the State House. So it isn't for lack of that, but let me suggest to you let me suggest to you a couple of elements. And I'm going to begin by lowering your expectation to tell you I don't have the silver bullet answer, but let me tell you part of it. Number one, when you go inland from the coast, not very far, people are not sensitive to this issue and are not motivated by it. Number two, there is tremendous concern, has been articulated by many folks up here, Jan articulated it, that we need to do things to protect our environment. We're very aware now of things like carbon emissions and sea level rise and things that we need to be able to deal with. And so it's very difficult if someone thinks that by doing what we're doing, for instance, in asking for an interim rule, we are somehow hurting the environment, then you don't get to the next level to discuss why that is, because it would be considered anti-environmental. Number three, when you do something that a lot of the environmental organizations believe to be anti-environmental, they have the ability to awaken the country. And the country has a 15-second attention span. And so it goes around very quickly that this is anti-environmental, people contribute money, those folks come and pressure the New England Fishery Management Council, both through the folks that represent them on the council and from lawyers who threaten to sue the federal government. Oftentimes they do sue the federal government, oftentimes they win, and the folks that are in the position of making decisions don't want to be sued and lose. So it makes it very difficult for them. And I'm going to give you one more.
Where does their money backup come from? Pews and oil?
Yeah, well, we can talk about that, but I don't want to digress too far at the moment, Safathi. But let me suggest just one other thing. And that is there is a tremendous reluctance, and many times this is for good reason, for legislative bodies or executive officials to interfere with the operations of their agencies. Because the folks that are running the agencies are presumed to have expertise that legislators don't have. And I've actually made this argument myself in the past. I do not want to make fisheries regulation on the floor of the Senate. We trust the Division of Marine Fisheries to do that, and if they go out of bounds, we try to pull them back in. In this case, there is more insulation in this particular bureaucracy from political interaction than I've seen in any other issue I've ever dealt with in my life. It is not partisan. It doesn't matter who the president is. It doesn't matter who the legislators are. There's always been, in my opinion, a tremendous reluctance to try to interact in a way that would change a regulation with the folks at NOAA. And by the way, I have conversations with folks at NOAA all the time. I think we all do. And it's not, we just need to find a way to get to that place of partnership, and we need to help them feel comfortable that by making the right decision, they aren't going to incur the wrath of all these folks who have a different agenda, and who, by the way, are willing to sue for that agenda and publicly embarrass the decision makers. So that's...
So are we willing to sue?
Well, we would be, and we have in the past. And one of the things that I think we can be particularly proud of is the fact that Gloucester, in that lawsuit that Vito was talking about, refused to concede. And because Gloucester refused to concede, we actually got to a better place in that one instance. Because the judge said, because we refused to agree with what was being proposed, go back to the table and work it out. And it was one of the most sterling examples that I've ever seen of the legal process working to put people at the same table and find a solution. The difficulty with lawsuits, and Gloucester and New Bedford have been in court more recently on another one, relative to the science and the fallibility of the science, is that it takes a lot of money and a lot of time. Now you have folks in this room who are fisher folk, harvesters, shoreside businesses, and by the way, one of the most iconic shoreside businesses and important ones we have is the one that Scott runs. And so we can talk a lot about when we lose boats, but when we lose the ice house or we lose the auction facility, we begin to come unraveled very, very quickly. So the problem is trying to find the resources to fund the lawsuit. And, you know, I'm aware, we like to sue people, but it's not, in this case, it's not going to happen fast enough. And it's not going to happen because the money just isn't there to come from an industry as good a job as the New England, as the Northeast Seafood Coalition does, and I'm a board member of the Seafood Coalition. But the money that funds that operation, for which we should all be indebted for the work that it does, comes out of the catch of the harvesters. There are some other members that contribute, funds as well. We should all be members of this Northeast Seafood Coalition for what they do for us. But right now, it's these guys right here that are paying out of the cod end for that effort. So when you ask them, okay, let's come up with a lawsuit, those of us that guide the organization, and John has been its chairman ever since its inception, we're very reluctant to urge a lawsuit just because it costs so much. And a lot of money is spent making incremental gains. Trying to modify the rules, trying to make the rules work. That's something BG was talking about, trying to tweak it. A lot of money gets put into that, day in and day out, that people never see because it's not the big flashy thing that goes in the newspaper. But it's this gentleman right here and some other folks at the coalition every single day sitting at a table trying to wrestle those things out. The most recent example we had to do with harbor porpoise. And it had to do with when you could go out and catch fish with a gill net. And originally, NOAA's position was they couldn't allow us to catch them in the fall. It was only going to be a spring fishery. But that didn't work with the economics of the fishery. So through a lot of good work, an unbelievable amount of good work, by this gentleman right here and others, we had a good conversation with NOAA, and we changed that. Incremental gains. The problem is right now, May 1st happens, the incremental gain kills us. Good, I'm sorry.
One of the things that I've heard is we've got to improve the science. Who drives the science? And I'm new to this topic here, but how do we get that changed so that if the funding was available to go use chartered boats or to improve the science, how does that get driven? How does it get funded? And is there a trigger to get the regulatory process to recognize a new scientific approach?
That's an outstanding question, and I could talk the rest of the night just about that, but I'm going to give you as compact an answer as I can. The standard in the Magnuson Act says that NOAA and the service and the federal government shall use the best scientific information available in making its decisions. The problem is that that's been interpreted over the years almost always as the federal government having the best science available. And trying to crack that is very difficult. And you can understand why. Because NOAA brings the resources of the entire federal government, and so you would presume that that has to be the best science available. But there are numerous examples that prove that that hasn't been the case. One of them involves pollock. A couple of years ago, we found out in the middle of the fishing season that the numbers on pollock were about 600% off. Now, to its credit, there was a reconciliation of that to allow everyone to catch more pollock. The second thing that happened is that one of the research boats, and I'm going to do my best to explain this, and I'm not a fisherman and I don't even play one on TV, but one of the research boats, when it went to do those tows that Damon was talking about, actually had ground cables that were not the same length. So what do we know about the fact if you're towing something with two different cables, the net closes up, and it wasn't catching the larger fish? Then everyone said, there's no large fish in the ocean. So there's no question that the science could be improved. The real challenge at a very high level is this. Folks in the federal government would argue that they've been measuring these stocks for decades, and they have models that they'd like to keep consistent. So when you come from left field and say, I have a new model that I want to try out, they look at it with skepticism because they have the consistency of those decades-old models. So what we have to do, number one, it's collaborative research is absolutely a necessity. There is no doubt about it. Damon hit the nail right on the head. A fisherman goes to find fish. When the bigelow goes out, it doesn't care whether it finds fish or not. And there's something else we know about fish, and Damon pointed this out a little bit. They're highly migratory. So if the fish aren't there the day when they do the tow, it tends to skew the numbers. So number one, we need to have the input of fishermen, and it can't be discarded. Because what these folks are telling you is really real. In other words, Joe will tell us, there's no cod around today. That's got to count for something in the model. but there has to be a comfort level, that partnership that Jan talked about, so people feel good about talking to each other honestly about this and don't conceal that information. And I'll tell you why. The fear has always been that if things aren't good, and the fishermen put that on the table, it will get used against them. And that precept alone has held back for decades the kind of honest conversation we need. And by the way, they have good reason to feel that. So we've got to get to a point where people feel comfortable saying, here's what I'm seeing, how can we work that into the science? And we have proposed in the past, and in fact, on one occasion it happened. We got federal disaster relief money for another closure, probably about 10 years ago, Vito, on the inshore. And the money was used actually to pay the fishermen to do research. So the federal government, to its credit, didn't say, we're just going to give you a handout. It said, we're going to buy research days from you and your vessel. So there is some limited experience trying to do that, but it's got to get to a better place. And we have to have the willingness to say, we're not going to say that no science is all bad, although a lot of us have a lot of issues with it. But we're going to say, let us develop another body of information and then see how the two relate to each other. Now, Representative Ferranti and I, for the last number of years, last 2 or 3 years, have been working on another project. And it involves trying to use sonar to understand what's going on in large tracts of the ocean. And the way that I would explain that is this. Right now, when the big didn't hit the fish, of the out presumption, no fish. Using sonar is like turning the lights on in the room. Now, there are folks that can do that at MIT and at Northeastern and other places. And in fact, the service itself had looked at this years ago. The problem is it's fairly costly. So we are working right now to find the dollars to be able to use that sonar to see what's going on in the whole ecosystem instead of the pinpoint that we use now.
Would that plug into the scientific model? Or
We
is it
think-
something different?
We think there'd be a way to use them together. But again, it's a two-step process. One, we need to find the money to do it. And we would argue that for the small fraction of money that it would cost of the overall research budget, NOAA should just fund it, number one. But number two, we would suggest that the second hurdle is getting NOAA to acknowledge that they would recognize that information. And I cannot in good conscience tell you right now that we've gotten that commitment, but we're working. And I'm going to apologize to everyone for that diatribe. But